Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, April 26th, 2023. I am really excited today because I don't have to moderate. We have a guest moderator, and I'm so excited. I will introduce her shortly. But before I do that, I want to remind you all that at Broadband Breakfast, we're a news and events company. We focus on broadband's impact, the infrastructure that enables broadband, and the applications like AI that are riding on top of that. It is a topic that is just skyrocketed in attention and interest, but perhaps we don't yet have our arms around the policy implications, right? And that's what we'll be talking about today shortly. But I just want to remind everyone, we're here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time for Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We've got a great series of upcoming events and some in-person events that I just want to mention briefly. Next Monday through Thursday, Broadband Breakfast will be at the Broadband Community Summit in Houston. There's many things going on that event. You can click our lead story on Broadband Breakfast and see one of them. It's a session on local broadband with a keynote by the assistant city manager of Brownsville, Texas. And we're talking about localities, cities, and their role in broadband deployment. That is an event that will be remote as well as live, and you can register for free to attend that event. So again, just follow the links on Broadband Breakfast to do that. If you want to go in person to the Broadband Community Summit, there's also a registration link for there. And friends of Broadband Breakfast, as all of you are being here on this program, we can provide you with the discount link if you haven't already registered as well. So just email me, drew@breakfast.media, and we'll be happy to give you the discount code for the Broadband Community Summit. We will be live streaming from Broadband Communities next Wednesday, May 3rd. I will be gathering people focused on MDUs, multiple dwelling units, and some of the broadband issues associated with improving connectivity for MDUs. And then the following week, May 8th through 10th, Broadband Breakfast will be at ConnectX in New Orleans. That is the Wireless Infrastructure Association's annual conference, and we'll be hosting a session on middle mile broadband and the role of state broadband officials in that process. So again, you can find all that at Broadband Breakfast. If you can't find what you're looking for, just email me, drew@breakfast.media. Before I turn it over to our moderator, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors. We could not do our programming on Broadband Breakfast, this free programming we do every Wednesday, without the support of Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Comcast, Nokia, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Lightbox, the Wireless Infrastructure Association, Ookla, the ComLaw Group, Michael Baker International, Bitstream Communications, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. Thank you to our sponsors for your assistance. Well, now with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our moderator. Let me change our screen view, and I'm going to shortly turn myself off. But Rebecca, thank you for being with us and for moderating this session on a topic that I know you're quite familiar with. You've been thinking a lot about. We're going to be talking, of course, about should AI be regulated, and we left it broad, but obviously the explosion of interest in generative AI through ChatGPT and those that have followed, Google and Bing, which is incorporating a part of ChatGPT, and in Bing, there's so much going on. I mean, my goodness, I just can't get enough of it, and I suspect our panelists can't either. But let me just introduce Rebecca. She is a technology policy reporter at The Hill, which of course is a leading Washington-based publication focused on politics and policy. And Rebecca in particular covers data privacy, antitrust law, online disinformation and other issues facing the evolving tech world. She's a native New Yorker and graduated from Binghamton University. And Rebecca previously covered local news for the York Dispatch in York, Pennsylvania, and the Island Now in Nassau County. So a real New Yorker, the Long Island variety there. Well, anyway, Rebecca, I will be in the background, but the floor is yours. And I certainly look forward to a very exciting discussion. I'll come on just a minute before we close to thank each of you and let you know about our next event. Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for joining. I have the honor of introducing our panelists today. Joining us, we have Daniel Castro. He is the Vice President at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and the Director of ITIF Center for Data Innovation. He writes and speaks on a variety of issues related to information technology and internet policy, including privacy, security, intellectual property, internet governance, e-government, and accessibility for people with disabilities. We also have Aaron Cooper joining us. Aaron serves as Vice President of Global Policy for the Business Software Alliance. In this role, Cooper leads BSA's global policy team and contributes to the advancement of BSA's members' policies priorities around the world that affect the development of emerging technologies, including data privacy, cybersecurity, AI regulation, data flows, and digital trade. Thank you both for joining us today. I guess to start, Daniel, do you want to speak a little bit about what you do and sort of your thoughts on AI regulation before we head into the questions, and then we'll switch over to Aaron.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks so much, Rebecca, for moderating this discussion. And so, yeah, I mean, I think everyone, we keep hearing about AI and everything that's going on with AI, new innovations always around the corner. Certainly, ChatGPT has brought the technology to the forefront and to the masses. It's had a higher rate of adoption than any other app and service in the past. So I think, whenever you have new technology, especially new technology that people don't fully understand yet, there's also a lot of uncertainty and fear about how it might negatively impact them. We all have, great wild imaginations, so it's easy to sometimes think about all the ways that the technology might go wrong. And I think, that's fine if you're writing sci-fi, but if you're, writing laws and you're trying to pass regulation or make new regulation, you need to be a little more grounded. And so, it's reasonable to ask what might go wrong and how might policies respond to that. But it's also, reasonable to take a deep breath and say, is disaster really imminent here? Are we maybe over concerned? And I think, here my main message is that, the sky is not falling. There's many things that we've heard about, that the AI might end, so many jobs. You see lots of headlines around this. There's concerns about AI and what it means for creativity and IP rights, concerns about AI and bias, concerns about, even AI and what it means for just the future of the human species and whether we're still relevant. And I think, what's interesting, and we actually have a paper on this coming out next week, is there have been so many technology panics in the past, including around creative technologies, everything from the printing press to film and video photography. And that we saw many of these same concerns play out, concerns about, is this going to hurt children in ways that we don't anticipate? Is this going to lead to, massive amounts of false information being distributed? Very similar concerns. You look at them and they could be sometimes today, but they were really from the 1850s. And so, the second message I'd have is that, a lot of times people say, well, this time it's different. And the reality is this time it's probably not different. They also said it was different with all those other technologies. And so it's important that we kind of keep things in perspective. And the last part I'd say is that, the message around regulating AI and what we should be doing in this space, it's not that, we shouldn't regulate AI. It's that we already are, right? There's already a lot of laws on the books that apply to AI. And so, I think what we have to be careful, though, is about saying, do we need new AI specific laws? And if so, why? So many people people have been talking in the policy circles about responsible AI and that we need responsible AI or trustworthy AI. I'm a little more concerned about, do we have responsible regulation of AI? Because it's very easy to come up with various types of proposals, from pure bans on various systems, like we saw with Italy saying they wanted to ban ChatGPT, to very strict attempts to regulate the technology in ways that would probably limit innovation. And not only, obviously it might limit some of the potential downsides, but it also might limit many of the potential upsides. We're already seeing how AI, there was a new study that came out yesterday, how AI can have a significant positive impact in productivity in certain jobs. We see studies come out every week about how AI can be more effective than maybe a trained radiologist at detecting certain types of cancers. We want to see this technology being deployed. We should want to see this technology being deployed. There are areas where it will likely have life-saving impacts, or it will have very positive impacts on the economy. And so part of our policy conversation should also be not just how do we make sure things don't go wrong, but how do we make sure things go right? And so I hope as we're kind of having this conversation today, we can bring in that side of it, because I think that's really one of the key points about where we should be focused.
Great, thank you so much. Aaron, would you like to share sort of your opening remarks on this topic?
Sure, thanks very much. Let me start by picking up on something that Daniel said about the sky not falling as a result of the developments in AI. And I think two things can be true at once. One, not only is the sky not falling, but as Daniel also said, there are a number of ways in which AI is going to help both the economy and help people do their jobs better and safer than happened previously. And at the same time, the second thing that can be true is that regulation around high risk uses can be appropriate and helpful for both the responsible development and ultimately deployment of AI systems. So just to back up for a second, so I'm Aaron Cooper. I work for BSA, the Software Alliance, which is an association of enterprise software companies. So it's one segment of the tech community, companies like Salesforce and Workday, Oracle and Microsoft, IBM, that provide primarily enterprise software solutions, cloud solutions, cybersecurity, and increasingly, of course, artificial intelligence. And we started working on AI policy issues about a decade ago as Congress and others in Europe were starting to think about what kinds of regulations might be appropriate for AI. And initially, a lot of what we worked on, a lot of the education that we tried to do on the Hill and elsewhere was focused around making sure that people realized that AI is not just about robots and not just about self-driving vehicles, not just about social media, but it's other things like database management that might not sound quite as exciting, but where AI can really be helpful. It's around health and safety issues. It can be in your router to help with configurations. So there are a number of ways that AI is being deployed, and at the time was starting to be ready to be deployed, that where a regulatory approach might be different for that than it would when you're making decisions about whether to give credit to somebody, whether to give housing to somebody, whether to give a job to somebody, where the decision is going to have a consequential effect on somebody's life. And in those situations, moving forward to now, we think that it is appropriate to have regulation to make sure that the way artificial intelligence systems are being developed and deployed in those kinds of high risk use cases is done with an impact assessment, so that the companies that are developing the system and the companies that are deploying are looking for what harms might happen and taking steps to mitigate those harms. But it's still important to distinguish different uses of AI systems, because the AI system for the router doesn't have the same considerations as the AI system for an employment case or even in a self-driving vehicle. So making sure that we think about AI in the different ways that it can be used and tailoring a regulatory approach to those that have high risk, they're in high risk situations, I think is a good way to look at it. We spent a lot of time putting together pretty detailed impact assessment, risk management frameworks. BSA did that a couple of years ago. NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, put one out earlier this year. And we're seeing more and more focus on what is appropriate for an impact assessment and what is appropriate what are appropriate steps to mitigate risk once it's been identified. And I think that can help both improve the system going forward and improve the way AI systems are developed and deployed, but it also help provide more confidence that the way it's built and the way it's being used is done in a way where the risks are being taken into account and mitigated where they can be mitigated. And that should all be done at the front end. There's still, there are laws on the books, as Daniel said, about what happens if something goes wrong, whether it's using an AI system or something else. If there's discrimination in employment decisions, if there's a malfunction in a product that's using, whether it's using AI or not, there are remedies, and those should apply regardless of whether AI systems are being used or not. We just think that in high risk situations, that there are some extra steps that the developer and the deployer of the AI system can take to help mitigate that risk and limit the possibility of it happening in the first place.
Yes, thank you both so much. I think for anyone listening who has a question, you can share that in the chat, and I can kick us off with some questions to start in the meantime. I think that one of the risks that I've been thinking about is sort of the term artificial intelligence and how it sort of has become a bit ambiguous, and we have sort of these ongoing concerns in terms of AI algorithms and automated systems, as well as now the rise in generative AI. And I was wondering if either of you have thoughts in terms of how Congress needs to approach this, and if there's a risk of sort of those terms getting muddled in terms of how they're approaching regulation, if there should be, more of separate paths in terms of how they're regulating this, and just what the level of understanding seems to be from policymakers and their staffs on these issues.
I'm happy to start. The OECD has put out a recommendation, or put out a definition of AI that I think is starting to get adopted in more places, and that's helpful. It's helpful in part because I think consistency and interoperability of rules governing AI around the world is useful. The more of a patchwork we have, not only the harder for businesses, whether they're the businesses like companies that I represent that are developing AI, or they're companies that are deploying them, it's both a compliance problem, but it's also for consumers who are using an end product, it's harder to know what protections have been built in if we have different regulations everywhere. So I think the using things like the OECD definition of AI could be helpful in that regard, and then making sure that we're not just lumping all AI systems into that, because while we might have one definition of AI, the way an AI system or any other technology is used, whether it's in a high-risk situation or not a high-risk situation, should have an impact on the way regulation is formed.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I agree. I mean, I think one of the challenges with the question over how to define AI is sometimes policymakers are trying to define it because then their next step is, after they define it, they want to pass some horizontal legislation. And obviously, if you have sectoral rules, you still need a definition of AI. But I think the reason for regulating AI always should be front and center, because sometimes the reason is that we don't understand how a decision is being made. And if that's the case, well, that applies to some types of AI, but not all types of AI. And so the types of remedies that might be necessary and the definition you might want to use might be different in terms of how you want to scope a particular rule. Sometimes the concern, though, is that there's a concern about automated decision making. And then it's not a question about AI, it's a question about, have you automated this decision? And then maybe you want to broaden it much broader than just AI, and talk about any process that's being automated and how you have human review or don't have human review in it. And so I think the rationale really is what we should be focused on, rather than the specific type of technology that's being used. Because the only other thing I'd mention here is that we want to make sure we future-proof whatever is being done. This is a fast-moving environment. If you look at the AI Act in Europe, the original definition possibly didn't include generative AI the way they wanted it to. And so, once everyone started using ChatGPT, they started, proposing all these amendments to say, well, generative AI, maybe that's a high-risk category all on its own, and we want to put it in there. So again, I think it makes sense to go slow in some of these cases, because I think that will help make sure we don't pass laws and regulations that maybe don't stand the test of time.
Can I say one other thing on that? I think it is, as Dan is saying, it's important to look at how how the AI system would be used, however we define AI, but the way we're going to look at regulating cybersecurity protections using AI or the configuration of your router is going to be different than what we're concerned about when you're doing employment decisions or when you're telling a vehicle whether to turn left or right, and making sure that the regulations are tailored towards what it is that we're trying to solve for is really important.
Thank you both so much. I think we have a question from someone that is listening that wants to know if there's anything being done to require some sort of identifying tag to indicate if information was made with AI rather than a human in a technically identifiable or visually identifiable way. Is that something that either you are aware of in terms of regulation or what companies may be rolling out?
I can jump in on that. There's, I mean, there have been some attempts to say, you should disclose when AI is being used. I think the best attempts, there's something called the Content Authenticity Initiative that's being launched by Adobe, Microsoft, a couple of companies like BBC, Twitter was initially involved. That is all about, can you cryptographically attach attributes to various types of media? So if you have an image, if you have a video, if you have a document, can you sign it, digitally sign it, and also say, who created it, if it was modified? And part of that is to address, misinformation that could be out there. Is this a fake video or is it from a trusted source? But you could also use that same type of technology to say, this came from, Midjourney, or this came from, Stability Diffusion or something like that. And so I think that's where we don't want to create something that is AI specific. We want to really change how do we do content provenance for all types of media, whether it's created by AI or created by humans. And that will help just increase trust across the entire digital media space. So I would say, hopefully we won't get into, we need to label things when it's created by AI, and instead move into a world where we're just trying to label where content comes from as a way to, improve trust overall.
One way that it starts to get complicated, and I think Dan's point about the Content Authenticity Initiative is a good one. It's an example of industry, different parts of different kinds of industry coming together to try to battle deepfakes. But AI is increasingly going to be used in different ways, and lots of ways that are sort of behind the scenes. So there could be AI in the way my word processing program displays things that I'm writing or suggests what the next word is going to be, or the way my email system picks from the database to display in a way that groups emails together. That kind of use of AI is probably not what we're thinking about when we think about either disclosing or regulating AI, but that's sort of one end of the spectrum, and the other end of the spectrum is going to be there's an AI system that is making an employment decision or recommending an employment decision, and those are really different ends of the spectrum. Or an AI system that is generating a picture that I then want copyright protection for. That's a whole different set of issues as well. So I think it goes back to wanting to look at what are the individual use cases and what are we trying to solve for. And there are places where disclosure absolutely should happen, and there are places where it probably doesn't matter or doesn't make sense, just because it's going to be so routine in our lives. So it brings up one other point, which is that we don't know all the different ways that particularly generative AI is going to be used and impact our lives. And I think we should be cautious at the outset and recognize that we don't know all those different ways, and try to focus regulation today on what are the potential harms that we're aware of, in terms of particularly when an AI system is making a consequential decision, what kind of regulation is appropriate around that. And understand that we're going to have more time in the future to think about what are the additional risks that are being presented, and what are the additional opportunities to increase the amount of trust and confidence in AI.
I could just add on, I think that the question of labeling AI sometimes comes from the perspective that people need to be aware that something wasn't maybe fully genuinely human created. I think that kind of misses the point, because a lot of the use cases for this technology is actually to improve communication. So for example, I was reading about I think it was a plumber or a contractor who, said he was just really bad at, getting back to his customers about, sending a message to follow up, scheduling, that kind of thing. And he hated texting. And so he actually really started to use some of these technologies like ChatGPT, because he could give a small message like, tell my customer I'll be there tomorrow. And they'd actually send a nice email, something that he would never do. And so it was improving the communication, giving the type of communication that he knows his customers wanted, but without having to put in that work that just wasn't a good fit for him. And so, I think if that had to be labeled, this is not actually, Joe the plumber, this is, instead ChatGPT that produced this, that kind of takes away the whole value of why the person was using it in the first place.
And I want to ask about your thoughts in terms of how the Biden administration is approaching regulation. I know BSA's CEO is actually at the White House, I believe, today to discuss this. And it seems like up until this point, there's been the White House Bill of Rights on AI, NIST released a framework, and it's been a lot of voluntary guardrails that they've put in place. And, as in the months since they've released that, the technology has continued to innovate with companies rolling it out. So if you have thoughts on what the Biden administration is doing, or what you think that maybe they should be doing to take these steps as Congress is also weighing these proposals.
Well, the National AI Advisory Committee, where our CEO is right now, is making recommendations as to what the Biden administration should do, but that's separate from BSA advocacy. I think that the Biden administration has done two things very well. One, they've put out frameworks like you referenced, the NIST AI risk management framework, that while voluntary, it's flexible, and so that it can continue to be used as AI systems develop and as AI systems are put into different uses. And it's not static in that if it's not sufficiently flexible to account for developments in AI, it can be easily changed in a way that legislation can't easily be changed, or it would take a decade. So I think that kind of flexible but real approach, so that eventually customers are going to say, well, have you gone through these steps? Because if you haven't, then we don't want to purchase an AI system for this high risk use, is really helpful. And the other, based on what came out yesterday from Department of Justice and FTC and EEOC, CFPB, about enforcement of laws that are already on the books, even when AI systems are being used, I think is also important, because as Dan said at the outset, there are a lot of laws that apply to AI, and regardless of whether you're using AI, based on what the outcome is. And I think for the administration to start looking at across the board, what are for instance, civil rights laws that can be enforced by different agencies depending on the use case, and then where are there gaps, is a good way of looking at, if there are gaps, do we need legislation to fill it? And if there aren't gaps, is it a question of making sure that we're using the enforcement power appropriately? And that does seem to be a focus, which I think is positive.
Yeah, I would just add on, I think so much of the conversation around AI regulation gets, there's this idea of who needs to be first to regulate. People see Europe passing the AI Act, and then someone says, oh, the United States is falling behind, we need to catch up, otherwise we'll fall behind in this race to regulate. And you kind of have to ask yourself, well, is there really a need for a race to regulate? Is this something we actually want to be competing in, or should we really be competing in the race to, deploy AI the fastest, bring it to more sectors of the economy, to, be in the race to, compete with China in this space? And that's where, I think the administration should really continue to put more effort. I think the NIST AI risk management framework is a great example of how it can approach, real problems that are on the ground, work with the industry to create this voluntary framework and address various concerns that are out there. And also, the letter that came out yesterday, one of the things that it did highlight is that there are a lot of existing laws and regulations. So yes, they can continue down that path, but we do need to see more attention focused on how the U.S. government is going to ensure that, U.S., all the various important U.S. sectors are lead adopters of AI. we still don't really see a concrete strategy that's being executed in that regard. We don't even see it within government. I mean, the IRS just recently got, I think it was $80 billion, right, that they have to spend now to modernize their systems. There was basically no mention of how they're using AI. There's no mention of how they're going to start using, this type of technology to reduce their requirements to hire new customer service agents. So I think there's a lot that still can be done in terms of, being optimistic about how government agencies and how various parts of this, the U.S. economy can be more aggressive in, finding use cases and deploying them where they can be effective.
Yeah, thank you. And I also just want to encourage more questions from the audience if anyone has. Another question I wanted to ask about is in terms of how do lawmakers should consider balancing trying to regulate AI without harming innovation. I know that's something that I've heard a lot from the industry side, and especially remaining competitive on a global scale. I think that, we've seen Microsoft and OpenAI really leading and Google close behind, but China as well is sort of ramping up in the generative AI space. So where do you sort of see, US policymakers trying to toe that line in terms of regulating AI without harming innovation? And do you think that, there is a risk of closing off that innovation and China sort of getting ahead if lawmakers overregulate?
If I could start maybe on this one, I would say I think the biggest difference right now between the United States and China when it comes to regulation, I mean, they both are, looking to, lead in this area. I think the assumption in the United States is that, the spending and the procurement of AI and defense and for national security purposes will have a spillover effect into the rest of the economy. And in China, they're thinking that there's going to be a spillover effect, not only from national security purposes, but also from widely deploying it in all sectors. And so, I think that model of having, both a strong commercial use and strong military use and defense use is important. In the United States, we're kind of creating this two-tiered system where we're going to have, defense spending on AI, I'm sure, and then we're going to have things like ChatGPT, unregulated, parts of the economy, entertainment maybe, search, these types of, various types of maybe some business tools, but we're not going to see it deployed in areas like transportation, healthcare, education, maybe even financial services, where there's huge opportunities and it's big parts of the U.S. market, but they're heavily regulated. So I think the challenge is how do we really accelerate deployment in those areas, and that's where again it's important that we don't not say we're never going to regulate it. But for example, the UK, they've just put out a white paper. The UK government put out a white paper on AI, and what it said is that first they're going to start with enforcing existing regulations, and they're going to basically not, at least for about a year, not do any new legislation. There's no plans for new legislation in this area. They want to first see where are the gaps and what the challenges are. I think that's the right type of approach. That way, you're paying attention to any types of problems that are out there. You can still be responsive. But again, we don't necessarily need to get locked into this race to regulate just because Europe's doing it.
I just add that I think we can absolutely do both. I think that we can encourage innovation and encourage adoption, as Dan was referring to, of AI systems in different regulated sectors, and at the same time have appropriate regulations that in cases that where the AI system is going to make a consequential decision or it's going to be used in a high risk use case, that there are some steps taken at the outset to mitigate any known risks as a result of it. And I think that combination would help build trust in the AI systems, which would help alleviate concerns from regulators, which would in turn lead to more adoption of the technology. So I don't think that they can be at odds with each other, but I don't think they are naturally at odds with each other. I think that there's a way to have appropriately tailored regulations that would improve the overall system, identify and deal with known risks, but also at the same time create the legal landscape that helps companies feel confident in adopting AI solutions. Having a good, strong national privacy law would be helpful for that. Good cybersecurity practices and requirements would be helpful for that. So I think there are a number of things that Congress and the administration can do that would both help with innovation, but at the same time put regulation on the way companies develop and deploy high-risk use versions of AI.
And building off that, you just mentioned privacy legislation. We have a question that's asking about what about regulation in terms of privacy and control of the personal data being collected by AI systems? I know that a big topic in Congress for years has been sort of the lack of a comprehensive federal data privacy law in the US as other countries proceed. And that sort of keeps coming up in terms of what the US should do in terms of AI regulation. So do either of you have an answer to that about what regulation in terms of privacy and control of data being collected by AI systems, as well as, additionally, how could a proposal on a comprehensive federal data privacy law sort of help address some of these issues that we've been talking about in terms of automated systems?
I'll start on this one if you don't mind. I think that they go hand in hand. There should be a strong national privacy law. I think we're just about up to 9 states that have laws that give consumers control over their data. Whether it's an AI system that's either collecting or being trained on the data, or if it's just being used with traditional data analytics or other processes, consumers should have control over their data. And I think it's good that we have 9 states where consumers do have that control, but it should be all 50 states and all territories, and we could use a federal law that gives those rights. It would also, candidly, it would give companies that are developing or using AI systems the confidence that they have a certain set of obligations, and they know when they can use data and when they can't use data. So I think it would be good both from the industry side and from the consumer side.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think, the sooner we can get a federal privacy law, the better for addressing those types of concerns. And it's still, I guess, an open question about when and how we get there. But still, hopefully, we'll move quickly. I think there's also a question, though, about the data that's being used for training, and hopefully, we don't get into the situation where that's being treated as a privacy issue, where information that's publicly available on the internet, that companies might have some kind of obligation to not process it if it's being used for, again, just kind of general training. This is kind of text completion training, where the private information isn't there. I think the other privacy consideration that obviously has come up is the information that people are feeding in to these systems, right? And concerns about whether it could be disclosed to somebody else or how it might be used in the future. Because ultimately, to use these technologies effectively, you want to be able to ask personalized questions, right? Like you want to be able to give it maybe very personalized information about you and have it respected. So I think there's going to be, ultimately some questions there that will need to be clarified. But I think, again, if we can get a federal law, that would answer most of this.
And I think you want consumers to be able to choose, right? So like when I'm using a map program to drive somewhere, I might want the map program to learn from my habits and which direction I go, because it'll provide me a better service, or I might not want that, and I should have that choice, but I don't want to lose the choice to have the map program improve for me.
Another question we have is if there's anything that's being done to indicate the data sources that are being used to create the outcome results of an AI generated solution. I think that's a topic that keeps coming up in terms of if there's a lack of transparency about where this data is coming from, as well as maybe touches on a bit of the intellectual property side. But is there anything sort of being done in terms of indicating where those data sources are coming from as generative AI ramps up?
I think it varies right now. I mean, some models have been, very clear. They've disclosed what their training data is, what those sources are, and others haven't. I would like to see, more standardization in industry. I think eventually, we're going to have what we call, smart procurers or large procurers who are going to make that a requirement. And we also saw, we haven't seen any legislative text, or at least I haven't, but Senator Schumer's proposal around AI did address that point. Specifically, one of the 4 parts of his proposal was that there would be some kind of disclosure about the data sources used. I think the only maybe challenge or risk with that is, you might disclose a data source, but if you don't have good information about that data source, so you could say, this came from this data corpus, but if there's not good information about what that is and what is included and not included in it, so that people can actually understand, well, maybe this data set isn't well representative of my particular community or geographic region or something like that. Or maybe, there's some other issue with the data set. Maybe it has known errors that can be, introduced. I think those are questions that still come up. Eventually, I think, we will have a lot more trusted data sources being used, data sources that are being invested in and treated as, data infrastructure that's core to our, core to these software. Just like right now, there's a lot of open source software that's, widely integrated into various commercial systems. I think we're going to have the same thing with data. Right now, a lot of the data that's being used maybe wasn't designed for this particular purpose that's being used for. It's just the best data we have. But eventually, I think the industry will get more mature in that regard.
I think it's also important to think about, you might have a large training set for the language model, but when somebody goes to retrain the system to be used to decide whether to extend credit to someone, they're using additional data that they're training that model on. And I think that's probably where we want to spend more of the focus is that data representative? Is that data going to perpetuate discrimination? Or have we done things with that data to do our best to make sure that it is representative and that it is not going to lead to discriminatory results? And it's in that retraining of the system that we really need to be careful, and that where I think we focus most of our thinking about what an impact assessment should do around the data that's being trained. It's that which could, if it's not representative, lead to really problematic results. But it sometimes gets lost in the discussion that there might be several steps of training data for that system before it's ultimately deployed.
Great. And do either of you have thoughts on, this idea of a 6-month pause on generative AI research, which I know that, some experts and as well as Elon Musk has sort of signed an open letter sort of pushing for that in terms of this space. Do you think that there's value to that, or if that would help address any of these concerns? I will add that I think after that letter went out, Elon Musk did announce his own AI company that he's launching, just to add in there. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on the letter?
Yeah, I mean, I think the letter was kind of bogus in terms of it's unrealistic to begin with. I mean, there's no realistic way that there's going to be a pause in this space. It did seem like it was very opportunistic for the high profile signers like Elon Musk to then go and say he's doing his own thing. But more than that, there's no real, a lot of their concerns are based around things like transhumanism, and I think they were making really inappropriate comparisons to that this is like eugenics and that we need to put a pause on it for those types of reasons. I thought it was incredibly kind of extreme to see something like that, and I think that really just reinforces the idea that so many of the concerns around AI are driven by this kind of panic narrative, as opposed to a more thoughtful sober look at the where there are risks and how those risks might be addressed. So I would say we don't need a 6-month pause. We need a 6-month sprint on how do we do this even better. Again, my point is never that there aren't real risks out there. Of course there are. But as with many technologies, we identify the risk as we're developing the technology, and we address it both through the market, through norms and standards that are put out, through existing laws and regulations, and through a whole host of other solutions. And sometimes we do need new laws, sometimes we don't. But we never say, let's just not innovate for 6 months because it's too risky. So I was, very disheartened to see that, but also not too surprised given some of the rhetoric around it.
I think we need to spend the next 6 months, as Dan said, doing a sprint, doing a surge on regulation, and looking at what are the things that we see today where AI systems could cause harm that we can identify, like in the discriminatory context, like what DOJ and FTC and others were pointing out yesterday. And let's figure out where there are gaps in the law, and let's fill those gaps and make sure that companies are developing and deploying responsibly using a risk management program.
And this is a question that came in from LinkedIn. Even if AI were regulated, how would this protect against enemy states and cyber criminals using AI in an unregulated fashion? I know we've been talking a bit on sort of more the domestic side and sort of those issues. Is there a way that you think regulators and policymakers should be considering how to sort of regulate AI in terms of how to protect against sort of cyber attacks?
I think there is a question about export controls around technology, and it's not just AI. There's of course many other technologies as well, where we should be looking very carefully at how, for U.S. policy and also the TTC, the transatlantic trade. I'm getting it wrong now. Transatlantic
Trade and Technology.
Yes, Trade and Technology Council. There's so much of a need for us to work together to make sure that good technology does not end up in bad hands, right? And so I think that is important that we pay attention. That said, so much of a lot of the AI innovation, it is open source, and it's open source, and a lot of technology is open source, a lot of code is open source. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So we also have to recognize that America's enemies will have access to a lot of this great technology, and so that's one of the reasons why adoption is critical, because there are concerns about how some of this, for example, generative AI could be used to, write malicious code or, mutate code, so it's harder to detect. But on the other side of that, there's also lots of ways that we can be using generative AI to have better defense, to, do better detection, to identify and patch areas where there might be flaws. And so, we should assume that the enemy has access to the technology while also trying to make sure we're not making it easy for them to get it. And so, I think there's a lot that could be done in this space. But the primary one is making sure that, we're late adopters so that we have the defensive capabilities that have been brought about by advances in AI.
Yep. There are going to be bad actors. Some of them are going to be nation state driven, and some of them are just going to be individual bad actors. And I think that the better we do in setting good rules of the road for good actors, the better off we'll be. And I think Daniel's point about the more we adopt AI systems so that we can defend against attacks, the more secure we'll be.
And this question gets a little bit to the concerns of AI changing the workforce a bit. Someone has asked, what role should the government have in monitoring applications of AI that have major implications on job dislocations in the economy? Do either of you have thoughts on that in terms of what role the government should be playing as that sort of changes?
I think it's a real and important issue. I mean, even before conversations about generative AI, it was clear that AI, traditional AI systems were going to have a big impact on the workforce. And some of it's going to be positive and some of it is going to be negative. And we need to be prepared for that. And we need to have training programs so that not just so that people can be in different lines of work, but more so that they can use AI in order to help them in their daily job. I think one of the problems that we see coming up is when you don't have enough people trained in using the technology, not trained in being AI experts, not trained in computer science, but trained in knowing how to deploy and use the system so that they can be more effective at the jobs that they have. I think the better off everyone will be, and the better we'll be able to put AI systems to work. But I do think that there's a role for government both in monitoring what the workforce shifts look like, and also thinking about what education and training policies have to be in response to that, and hopefully in advance.
Yeah, I'll just add, the White House put out a report, I think it was last year, that looked at this question of AI's impact on the workforce, and it just emphasizes that point. Like we do want to see workers adopt the technology, we do want to see industry adopt the technology, but we also have to be responsive to changes in the labor market, and that's not something that is going to be related, I think, just to AI. There's always changes in the labor market. Some of it due to changes in trade relationships. So we always want to make sure that we have good policies in place to help workers when there are changes in the economy. And I think if we get those good policies, that will also address some of the fears that people have about how this might affect their employment. But I also think, when we look at the opportunities, I mean, you think about something like AI in education, right? Nobody's saying that we have too many teachers right now. We have, teachers exiting the field. If we can make schools better, with this technology, we can help kids learn better. That will have a huge positive impact that isn't going to be about, creating unemployment and, the education system. It's about, having, maybe smaller student to teacher ratios, or, helping kids learn better. It's so, I think in a lot of areas, maybe some of the concerns overstated. That said, I mean, there's obviously some real ones. I mean, we want to see more automation, more robotics, and things like warehouses. That will ideally lead to fewer people employed in those jobs. But in many cases, these are also jobs that are, what they call the dirty, dull, dangerous jobs, right? So it's not necessarily a bad thing to get people into, higher value work. In fact, over the long term, it will be very good for both those individuals as well as the overall national economy.
Right. And especially since you just mentioned schools and teachers, we do have a question in terms of how generative AI and the rise of tools like ChatGPT are impacting schools and students. I think that's sort of a story that captured a lot of attention when the tool was first launched, is that students were sort of using it to cheat on homework, on tests. No, I heard a Microsoft executive say during a meeting once that that's not a risk that they thought would happen, which I think is telling of the sort of engineers and people that they hire. They needed to maybe hire some English majors in the room to get them thinking that way. But what are your thoughts in terms of how regulation could handle that, as well as if there are, as you're mentioning, sort of, positive outcomes in terms of using this technology in schools as well that maybe, different educators could be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying I think there's a role for digital literacy here to help students understand both how the tech, we want them to be using it. We don't want them to go through school and never have used this technology. We want them to learn how to use it and how to use it effectively. We want them to know that maybe you can't trust the output of some of these systems. You have to go and verify sources and make sure they're real. But if people are able to write, students are able to write a paper more effectively using this tool, just like in the past students used spell check, and that raised questions about, will students learn to spell, and also legitimate questions about do students still need to learn to spell, or can their time be better spent doing other things? I think there's a balance there, and I think it will continue to evolve. There's also, I think, an opportunity right now, for a lot of students, that there's a little bit of I don't know if you call it like education arbitrage, where they're able to take it. Some students are probably taking advantage of the system, and some teachers and professors are probably taking advantage of it too. Maybe they don't want to have to write out their lesson plans every day that their principal is making them do, so they're using it to shift their workloads. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but most of it is positive. I think where it's negative is where if a student's only motivation to learn is that, or only opportunity to learn is by passing some homework that they didn't want to do, and now they can cheat on it. Well, yeah, that's a problem, but that was probably already a problem because they might have already been cheating by copying an essay from the internet, or getting someone else to do it for them, or maybe just not even turning it in. So I think this can also challenge the education system to focus on how do you develop, how do you engage students, how do you allow them to use the tools that are available. How do you make it so if you want to teach them a skill, you're able to do it in a way that even if they have a tool that would make it easier for them, maybe they sometimes leave it aside because they want to challenge themselves in new ways. I think those are the types of things we should look for. Just like kids can do math on a calculator, but we still teach them how to add, right? Like there is always a line there.
I'm old enough to remember when calculator watches first started to become popular, and teachers were worried about kids bringing them in and using them. But there's also the flip side of it is like, so my daughter is in elementary school, and they do have some lessons that are done through apps online, and the more sophisticated those can be and the better at teaching her, the better off everyone will be. So there are pros and cons, and just as always, we need to be careful that students are learning what their teachers want them to learn.
And I think we're sort of coming up on the end of time here, but quickly, if either of you have thoughts on sort of the IP concerns about AI, or specifically thoughts on Getty's lawsuit against Stable Diffusion over AI image creation, and sort of how you think Congress should be approaching, and the administration, sort of the IP concerns on AI, or if you think that they've been doing that effectively.
So I think there are reasonable issues that are being raised about how AI systems are being trained and what they're being trained on, and both a privacy issue, but there's also the copyright issue, and for generative AI systems, what the output is. But I think that the current statute in the U.S. has enough flexibility built into it so that usually fair use is what takes care of making sure that the way an AI system is trained is not reproducing the copyrighted work for the expressive content of that work. But if it's just picking out the unprotectable facts as a way of training a system, that's something different that falls under fair use. For the output, there are, again, legitimate issues where it's going to have an effect on the marketplace. But if the output is substantially similar to a copyrighted work, it should be infringement, because that's what the law is, regardless of whether an AI system is being used. So I think it will present new issues, but I think it's one where we don't quite know how it'll play out yet, and looking at it, but not moving too quickly and not assuming that we know how it's going to play out is important.
I'll just add on, I think, there's a couple of principles here that matter. One is, if humans can do it lawfully, AI systems should be able to do it lawfully too. And there's obviously a little bit of a fine line there, because the process of how a human learns versus how a computer learns might involve creating some kind of temporary copies of data. And if you make that copy, there's a question, well, is that infringement? But we've also faced that in the past, right? I mean, search engines, for example, index websites and create thumbnails of images, and courts have ruled that is a transformational use, and that it's lawful. It's under fair use. I think in many cases, if content has been lawfully accessed, it should be allowed to be trained on it. It shouldn't have to maybe separately get additional permission to do that. I think as a general principle, I think that would be useful. But that doesn't mean that you can create output, just because the input might be lawfully accessed, doesn't mean the output will always be lawful. And I think that's where we really have to pay attention. As Aaron said, I mean, if you produce something that is an exact replica of the input, that's obviously infringement. And there's going to be other areas where there's a gray line there. I also think, there was the recent case of, what was it, The Weeknd, and I forget who the other artist was, right there. There was a possible infringement, and there's kind of a little bit of potential gap in some of the copyright law. And I think, there's probably two things we need to make clear. One is, if especially for music labels, if they're licensing the music, if an AI system wants to train on it, they probably should be paying for that. Because there's an existing business model, they're trying to license it, there's an opportunity to license for it, and they should pay. But also we need to think about publicity rights for artists, because I think right now that's where the gap is. It's because if you're creating something that is a Taylor Swift song in everything but her name, that's probably infringement. If you and we already know that there are lines there, right? Anyone can be a musician and wear a white jumpsuit, but if you're wearing a white jumpsuit and it has an eagle, with the tassels and gold and red, and you are probably an Elvis impersonator, you need to start paying royalties. So we know there's some lines that can't be crossed, and I think the same thing will apply in AI.
Well, that may have to be the last word. Rebecca, thank you so much. I want to just remind everyone that these events are available at the link that was put in the chat earlier, and I just repeated the link for all of our Broadband Breakfast Live online events. Look for several upcoming ones, both a special event at Broadband Communities at 1 p.m. Eastern Time or 12 noon Central on Monday, May 1st, and then, of course, our regularly scheduled Broadband Breakfast Live online every Wednesday at 12 noon. On behalf of our moderator, Rebecca Clar, thank you so much for bringing this issue to light, and obviously so many more questions than we could address. And also, of course, Daniel Castro and Aaron Cooper. We will all see you next Wednesday at 12 noon. And don't forget, next Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Thanks. Take care.